We tend to think of poetry as a kind of head down, nose in a book, very private thing. But on Pele's poetry podcast today, we're going to be looking at poetry as a much more heads up and public thing. It's a kind of lonely enterprise, isn't it? Reading poetry and writing poetry, Pele? But it doesn't have to be. It can be very, very public indeed.
Yes, well, when the poet's writing the poem onto the page by candlelight in the garret, um, he or she doesn't know where that poem's going to go or if it will ever be read, in the cliched sense and in the real sense. There's a lot of hoops that a poem on the page, written on the page, has to jump through to get into the ears and eyes of its public, and many never reach that place. I always think of all the great poems out there that no one's ever going to read or know about. So when a poem or a poem is born from an expectation or from a request from the outside world beyond the candle and the table and the page, the whole thing potentially tips on its head. And I think today one of the things we might be able to resolve is, does that change the nature of the poem, or is it just moved itself like a little drone from one part of the creative self to another?
And does it then go from being the private property of the poet to the public property of the audience? And a secondary sort of question, do you not think that some poets don't sit down and write something knowing full well that they want it to have a public life, and they're giving birth to it privately, but they want it out there as soon as possible?
Yeah, I mean, everything that we talk about these days together on our podcast seems to live, I feel like we're on a meridian line. We're standing in the past and in the future of the answers to these questions. How important is it that a poem is known by others? And surely the key relationship is between the poet and the page. And there's so many ways to contradict that. I remember Seamus Heaney said that the poem was like an apple and that it was never known like an apple until it was bitten and tasted.
A lovely way of thinking of it.
Terrifying thought for anyone who isn't published, or, I think a poem can be public, can't it, in lots of different ways. You and I being a perfect example, right, Rich? You have read me nearly all your poems out loud. You have a reader who is a great admirer of your work already in the world. How many readers does one need? I remember I had a conversation with the great sculptor Richard Long at dinner once, and I was a young poet in residence at Tate. And I remember saying, I've got this book of poems that I've written while I've been in residence. And I had written a lot about the artworks on show at the time. And I said, I need to get a publisher. I need to get a publisher. And I remember him turning around to me and saying, when I was a young sculptor, I produced a catalogue of my work, the best work, and I just put it, I got 15, 25, 30 copies printed, and I just put them on the desks of all the important people in the arts, or the people that I wanted to see what I'd been working on. And he said, you don't need hundreds and thousands of people to be the artist that you are.
Right. Well, the two poets that we have to accompany us today very definitely do have a following of hundreds of thousands or of millions built up over time, and certainly built up over time in the case of Sir Philip Sidney, who actually didn't publish any of his poetry during his lifetime. It was published after his death. He lived from 1554 to 1586 in Elizabethan England, a time that was full of intrigue, and he used his pen and his mouth to wangle himself out of all sorts of dead ends, literally dead ends and difficulties. That was the the misfortune of many others who felt the full force of Elizabeth I's displeasure. And the other poet that is going to accompany us in this podcast is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Tell me a little bit about her, because I'm not terribly familiar with either, to be honest. So tell me a bit about EBB.
Well, she is a fascinating study of the evolution of a poet's existence or destiny or fate, driven quite obviously by her poetry practice, and her circumstances and how her determination. I think, poets who really want their poems to be read have a certain kind of determination about them. They're sort of like hedge cutters or something. Or plows. They plow through the landscape to get their poems, to be poets rather than to be read poets or popular poets, I think. Anyway, she was rather ill when she was young, an invalid for most of her life, always having to go to bed and lie down and be sent away to the seaside to recuperate, to get the clean air for her lungs. And one of the things about this was that it let her off the hook of having to be a domesticated creature. So all the time that her sisters and friends were, cooking or cleaning or holding parties in parlours, she was alone with a book, writing and reading, and she was a great scholar because of it. She wasn't just lying around thinking, I can be a great poet now. She was reading all the great poets that she loved and learning them and learning from them and translating them, and from that evolved her great poetic voice.
And she started young, didn't she? Her first sort of poem, certainly that we know of, was, I think, written aged 11. So she started really early. And as you say, that metaphor of ploughing on through the difficulties, through the sort of heavy soil of life, that determination, not just ploughing through the challenges of becoming a poet, but also those physical, those health challenges that, as you say, shortened her life. I've written it down here somewhere. Don't think that I've memorized these numbers. I haven't. 1806 to 1861. And you're speaking to me from Italy. You're still there. You were in a previous episode of Pele's poetry podcast. And she is a fellow traveller to the extent that she spent quite a bit of time in Rome and in Florence. And I think it was in Florence that she finally succumbed to her illness as a young age in her 1950s.
In her 1950s. That's nice. Because
In
the
her
poet is
50s.
eternally young and eternally old, Rich.
Exactly. So if Sidney was an Elizabethan, Barrett Browning, very definitely a Victorian. All right. So poetry for public purpose. What public purpose did Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry serve?
Sorry, of course. Back to the point. So she was her family. It's the funny thing about talking about poets, isn't it? It's not like you're talking in a straight line. Their lives are always so verbose and complex and contradictory.
Which is why it's really challenging for us to sort of hold the line, to remember what we're here for, and that we do have a plan. Sticking to it's the hard part.
Yeah. Anyway, basically, her family were slave owners in the West Indies, and the family, not her direct family, her grandfather. So, as she was an abolitionist, and she campaigned a lot about these things. Anyway, just to cut to the chase, one of her great poems is called The Runaway Slave. It's about a slave who murders her child, who's a child that's been born from a white slave owner. I'll keep a cool voice while I'm talking about it, but when I think about it, this fire inside me rises, as it does in anyone who comes into contact with this extraordinary piece of work. It's inspired by the dramatic monologues which her husband the great Robert Browning had instituted, and she also has instituted the dramatic monologue start form to deliver this message of tragedy and a political travesty in the voice of one woman who speaks all the horrors. So I'm just going to read it out because obviously it's very long. It's about 40 stanzas. I'm just going to read the most tragic bits to me. The other interesting thing to say about it is it inspired Toni Morrison's Beloved. And when you read it, it makes you want to go back to that great book of only 30 years ago. For hark, I will tell you, lo, lo, I am black, you see, and the babe who lay on my bosom so was far too white for me, as white as the ladies who scorned to pray beside me at church, but yesterday through my tears had washed a place for my knee. And my own child, I could not bear to look in his face. It was so white. I covered him up with a kerchief rare. I covered his face in close and tight. And he moaned and struggled as well might be, for the white child wanted his liberty. Ha ha, he wanted the master's right. He moaned and beat with his head and feet, his little feet that never grew. He struck them out as it was meat against my heart to break it through. I might have sung like a mother, but I dared not sing to the white-faced child, the only song I knew. Now, I encourage everyone to read the whole thing if you want to go on a journey of truth and bravery from poet and speaker. But just to go back to our subject, that was written for a reason. She wanted to shock and awake as many people as she could to the tragedy of these situations. Using her skill as a poet, she understood that because she was a poet, she had this extra superpower to deliver a message like no one else could. Anyway, she wrote it for the abolitionist annual, the Liberty Bell, and it was printed in that. So it had a function right from the start. And here we are talking about it to this day.
Yeah, and that function was very definitely in the front of her mind, you think, as she wrote it. That presumably put huge pressure on her because it was a heavy responsibility to bring to the world's attention the awfulness of the slave's plight.
Well, I think it was all going on at the time, wasn't it? Even Byron was clamoring against this terrible reality that was about to be abolished. So they were all doing very well and with their cause. If only we could all do so well with ours these days. But just to tell you one other thing about to contextualize it. Elizabeth Barrett Browning had two brothers. One of them, who was out on the slave plantation, died of cholera or scurvy or something. And then 6 months later, her most beloved brother drowned in the sea on a sailing trip in Devon. And she was so overcome with grief, she could hardly function. Her health deteriorated so much, she nearly died. So this poem was written just after that, I think. And you can feel that her pain and the pain of the slave women are aligned here. She was using her own pain to describe the pain of this character.
And presumably this set her family against her, or certainly her father and her slave-holding grandfather. They would have taken a dim view of this.
I think by this point, they were dead. I don't know if her father was dead. I don't think he was a slave supporter. I think he was an abolitionist himself. So she wasn't embroiled in that element. She was embroiled in the aftermath and the sort of, the legacy of it, the shame of it.
What strikes me listening to the lines, the stanzas that you read, is that it can be shocking and beautiful in equal measure. So the language she deploys to describe murdering her own child is at once both beautiful and heart-wrenchingly awful, if that makes sense. That there is no need to shock by your choice of word. You know, you think of some poets that would use the F word or even the C word today. There's no need for that. It's rendered in a beautiful language, but it's making a really grimy point.
How do you think she does that? Did you find that it was the simplicity of the language? Or, I mean, to me, it's quite conversational.
Yeah, and I'd say also with the description of the kerchief and the colours and the actions that it's very visual. If you were making a film of that poem, it would be quite easy to describe the scenes in order to, put together a shooting script in a way that if confronted by deliberately shocking words, they don't conjure up so readily images. So it is image rich, which good poetry must be.
And Rich, just to repeat the words there, you know all about this because you have found a language for your own extraordinarily painful experience.
Well,
Um,
of nothing compared to the runaway slave at Pilgrim's Point, but nonetheless, yeah, it is important, I think, to try to find beauty in the darkness in order to illuminate the path for others. If that doesn't sound too grandiose, not many people get to walk that way, and therefore it does need to be illuminated. And just cursing and ranting and raging wouldn't serve that purpose at all.
I mean, this is where the poet's life, suffering, a terrible experience, can become a gift to the world.
What I found extraordinary doing some background for this podcast was how, despite the fact that there are a couple of hundred years between them, there are echoes of what Sir Philip Sidney wrote in 1595 or was published in 1595 in the Defence of Poesy and the Defence of Poetry. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning's writing, which wasn't just about the plight of runaway slaves, was it? She also wrote in critical ways of the way that impoverished children were taught in London that they should have a better education and so on. So she was very, very socially active. But what Sir Philip Sidney said in his defence of poesy that he saw the purpose of poetry and indeed of wider life as well doing and not of well knowing only. And you can certainly see that Elizabeth Barrett Browning was living up to that purpose nobly in The Runaway Slave.
What does he mean by that phrase, do you think?
That one can't simply know the plight of the runaway slave and then put it out of mind and forget it. That one should be precipitated to action. I think at some other point, Sidney argued that poetry was defendable or defensible in its own right as a means to move readers to virtuous action. And if your words didn't move readers to virtuous action, well, then it was something less as a consequence. And I find it inconceivable that anyone with a soft heart or an ounce of humanity wouldn't read The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point and feel that slavery was I can't think of the words to describe how awful it must have been, but that it needed to be abolished and abolished now, then, as it was. It moved people to virtuous action.
Yes, and it's funny that Philip Sidney's the one who aligns these things in one line so beautifully because he was not necessarily a virtuous courtier. He was a political operator, wasn't he? And he was popular, handsome, loved, probably a bit of a rogue, and in love with Anne Boleyn. Also, he established the sonnet. He gave it ground, and he was the first man to give it ground in England. So he made a habit of the sonnet, made it familiar in court, gave it voice, gave it that conversational tone that we take for granted now. and used it to write this coded, scandalous work, which is one of the great works of an illicit affair ever written, right?
Yeah. So if you can't openly criticize your enemies or those you disagree with, do it in poetry, do it in code, and get away with it. Have the quiet satisfaction of your criticism reaching more ears than it might have done. But keeping your head, literally in his case, keeping your head when many others were losing theirs in Elizabethan England. You mentioned there that he introduced the sonnet form to England, and one of the criticisms of poetry that he was defending against was the idea that poetry was somehow aligned or misaligned with youth, with being effeminate and being timorous. And there are people still today who would, particularly with the sonnet form, say that poetry was a bit soft. It was not the preserve of muscular men of action, but he was, a muscular man of action. He died a man of action in his 30s, having received a bullet wound defending the Netherlands against the Spanish. He took a bullet in the leg and died of gangrene 25 days later. So nothing effeminate or timorous about his life. He lived poetry as well as wrote it. Does that make sense? He kind of had a poet's life.
Well, there isn't one poet we haven't spoken about who hasn't. I just love the way that it's like every single poet's life is like their fingerprint, equally intricate and complex and utterly different from the next.
And is that what makes them a poet partly, do you think?
I think writing the poetry drives you more deeply into your identity and therefore creates experience in your own life that others may have passed others by, or a poet is watching out for things that happen, or a poet is waiting to absorb experience. And that shapes your existence, doesn't it? You're ready for anything, and anything will find you.
And anyone might find you. I mean, the risk that, to a lesser extent, Elizabeth Barrett Browning took, certainly the risk that Philip Sidney took, was that people would find him, people that weren't happy with what he'd written would find him, and that they would lock him up in the tower and, off with his head. So there is a price to be paid for being critical of the establishment. And I think that certainly holds true, even more so potentially today. So there will be poets writing now for public purpose in order to try to move readers to virtuous action, who will be risking their lives in doing so in places like Gaza, in wider Palestine, in Ukraine, in Trump's America. I mean, Trump's America has echoes with Elizabethan London, doesn't it? Elizabethan Britain, where one wrong word to the wrong person means that you're at the very least incarcerated.
Completely. And just to go back to Sidney for a second, because we can't not mention this poem that got him imprisoned, which is the sonnet Whoso List to Hunt, and is a love poem for Anne Boleyn, disguised as a poem about the hunt of a hind with a diamond collared collar. And it's one of the most radical poems of illicit love ever written. I won't read it all, but it is just an extraordinarily crafted code for a love in danger, a love endangered, and a metaphor really for just writing against the oppressor and against, we all live in a prison, don't we? We're all imprisoned by something in society, however far or near. And this is an example of the sonnet breaking down the walls. And of course he's punished for it. Like Ovid was sent into exile for writing a poem about love. I think it's a good idea to read the poem.
Read it.
Whoso list to hunt, I know where is an hind. But as for me, Hellas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore, I am of them that farthest cometh behind. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the dear, but as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. I leave off therefore. Sithens in a net I seek to hold the wind. Who list her hunt? I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. And graven with diamonds, in letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about. Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame.
Very good. You certainly did it justice. And it got him jailed. So the code wasn't so encoded that no one else got it.
Well, that's what the cheeky poet does, isn't it? They leave it and they leave lots of clues.
Forgive me for being so cheeky, Pele, but you have been the hind and you've been hunted. You know what I'm going to ask you about now. Sometimes the hunt goes awry, and the hind gets away after a period in captivity. This is all sounding very gnomic, isn't it? Let me be blunt. You were chased by, can I put it this way, indelicately? You were chased by a married man. You had an affair. It was all pretty messy, and that found its way out through a piece called The Mistress Account. So, in a sense, we're all writing about the same stuff, about the human condition, about love and loss and memory and intrigue. Did you have to encode the Mistress Account in order not to offend those involved?
Absolutely not. And I didn't want to either. And I wrote the poems because the affair came to a tragic end for me and everyone probably involved in the end. And being a poet, that was where I turned in my agony to the page. And I had a great admiration for the poet Sharon Olds, who had written this book about a book of poems about her husband, announcing that he had fallen in love with another woman and walking out the door to be with her. And she's left with her book and her page. And these poems are like fireworks. Stag's Leap is the name of the collection. You're almost sitting in her seat watching this man who she's been with for 30 years walking out of the door. And obviously I was in the opposite situation. I was a poet who had been the mistress, who had not walked out, and my lover had not walked out the door to be with me. So I felt there was a space for me to write down my story. And on closer look, I realized there was absolutely no literature. I still can't find any in the mistress's voice when an affair comes into play. It's either in the husband's voice or the wife's voice, or the woman married woman who's had the affair, but no one like me. So I felt pretty pissed off, and I felt like I was being gagged by the people involved and thrown into the gutter in a way. So I decided to look at the stars and write it down, and I wrote it down in truth.
Yeah. Don't gag a poet is the lesson from that.
The Sunday Times rang me up and asked me if I'd write a feature about the story, because they'd read these poems, which are a Cinderella story in reverse, really, and they should be read in one go. And they have been read almost as a stage piece, so they are a monologue in a way. And they do set the mistress right in the middle of the tragedy. And I've read it to a lot of people, and I read it at the Cheltenham Literature Festival. I think you were there, Rich. I read it in London a lot of times. And I start off saying, I had an affair with a married man, and I can feel everybody wince. and sort of hate me, think homewrecker and bitch. But by the time I finish reading, people run up to me with an empathetic tone and with warmth in their eyes. And to me, that's what poetry is meant to do. It's meant to change the minds of people in the room. It's meant to disturb the universe. It's meant you walk in thinking one thing, you listen to poetry and you come out feeling another. That is what I'm a poet for.
That comes back to Philip Sidney's point that it's about well-doing and not well-knowing only. It's no good if people know what happened in your case, but to be led to well-doing. And his other point that it stirs readers to virtuous action, even to feel more empathetic towards the role of the person whose voice has not been heard ever in poetry, because your position, as you say, is very different to that of Sharon Olds in Stag's Leap.
And the last poem in the collection is dedicated to her, actually. But I think poets need to be rebellious. And sometimes that's about the way your public face, you have to wear an ugly mask. And my rebellion was not a polite one. I wasn't being a rebel in a fashionable kind of way. It wasn't a memoir of, an agony of my childhood experience, or no one had done anything to me. It was my own responsibility. So it wasn't a polite rebellion. I was very risky for me to, put my reputation on the line and admit that I'd been a naughty girl.
And was that impolite rebellion worth it poetically?
Well, when the Sunday Times rang me up and asked me if I'd write a feature, which would include the poems, I thought about it for a week. I thought this could really screw my career. And then I thought, but I've been a poet for 20 years. And am I going to sit at home and write poems about flower pots? Or am I going to do something, the thing that poetry is really meant for? So I did it.
And
So I
we've
jumped.
we've touched in previous episodes, as I'm sure we will again in future episodes, on this need to be truthful, searingly, painfully truthful about which one writes. And that doesn't just risk hurting readers and those intimately involved in the subject matter, but it also risks hurting the wider reading public, those on the periphery of an event that you're writing about as well. I mean, there is a risk involved, and that's, I guess, to overcome that risk, to plough on, to use your expression. You said that Elizabeth Barrett Browning was ploughing on through all of the trials and tribulations that made it difficult for her to do what she did. But you've got to plough on regardless. Hell with the consequences.
Yes, and just to mention that I'll just quickly read the first poem that I wrote in the collection, because it sets the tone. This was like a sort of newspaper. I was reporting. I was using exactly like Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I was using my poetry skills to tell a story. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning falls in love with Robert Browning when she's about 39. So this really is a Cinderella story, and it's not in reverse. And it did happen to a poet. And she writes her great sonnets from the Portuguese, which are 40 of the greatest love poems ever written. And why are they called sonnets from the Portuguese? Because she didn't want anyone to know that they were about her own love affair, because it felt indecent. So she pretended she translated them from some Portuguese love poems.
And does that include the very famous one that many people will be familiar with, How Do I Love Thee?
It definitely includes it, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'd certainly encourage listeners to dig out not just the runaway slave at Pilgrim's Point, but if you want a counterpoint to that, to look up How Do I Love Thee? Incredible. But over to you. And this is what do they say in the world of music? We're gonna play out to the first few stanzas of the Mistress account. So I'll say goodbye, and I'll say thank you very much, Pele, for this edition of Pele's Poetry Podcast. And the Mistress account.
Thank you. The rules. Ask for separate bedrooms. Do your own thing. Do not fall in love with him. Take books, including a guidebook, so you can explore on your own if things get rocky. Have a task. Make sure he doesn't think you think it's a holiday. Take shades through which he cannot see your eyes. Take your own money. Be as blank as possible. Take a notebook to write in furiously. Think along the lines you know. Bikini, the horizon, poetry. Let him decide. Buy him a novel. Take more poetry. Some barrier. SPF 65, not just for your skin. Don't text furiously. It's rude. Remember, you are creating another world with just one room. Don't have the answers. They are up to him anyway. For now, it's you. And that is a silent thing. Make him happy. Think about your self-esteem. And if you have any, cancel him.